All right, shall we get started
Welcome.
or wait it out a
Yes.
little bit?
It's completely
I
up to
think we're
you. I
okay
mean,
to begin. So I just want to say thank you again for being willing to join us in this conference. This is our way of pushing back against the impacts of COVID-19 to say, no, this is still what we do and our work can still go forward. And so this is a really positive experience for us to provide these opportunities. And I hope that this conversation this morning is also a positive experience for all of us who are involved. So without further ado, since we're a small group, we can be somewhat informal. So Tejpaul, would you like to go ahead and get started and share your work with us?
yeah. Well, good morning to everybody. Happy to be here and present my work. Just a little bit of background. I mentioned it earlier to the host as well as Kimberly. My presentation will be Sikh American Historic Preservation, and a variation of this paper was to be presented at 3 different conferences. One, the Asian American Studies Conference, one being a historic preservation conference on Asian Americans University of Maryland, and then the third was supposed to be Sacramento at California Historic Preservation Conference. So the main purpose of this paper is to essentially talk about historic preservation, the gatekeeping within historic preservation, and Sikh American historic preservation. So to begin, what is historic preservation? A lot of people come up with different definitions of it. So historic preservation is the practice of protecting and preserving sites, structures, or districts which reflect elements of local or national cultural, social, economic, political, archaeological, or architectural history. So anything of local or national significance is, and protecting those sites is historic preservation. So there are many different levels of significance. So it starts at the local level. So the city and counties, they typically have a committee that designates these sites. Certain cities do not have it, so they'll be at the county level. For example, the city of Stockton has a historical landmarks committee. The city of Fresno does not. That is done through the county. And then the second stage will be at the state level, state historic landmarks, and that is controlled by the state government. There's a state historic preservation officer that works for the state, and they're the main individuals that kind of gives the stamp of approval. The 2 stages at the national level are the National Register of Historic Places, and then essentially the cream of the crop is the National Historic Landmarks. So I'll initially first focus on these last 2. So national sites, the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 was passed in an attempt to preserve history from expansion and to ensure that those sites that are significant to American history are preserved. So the National Register, which I mentioned earlier, there are roughly over 90,000 properties that are recognized for their significance in American history. However, when it comes to the National Historic Landmark, there's not even 2,600 properties on the National Historic Landmark. The process to get on the National Landmark is much more complex. In terms of the National Register, that you typically work with the State Historic Preservation Officer, and once they're the ones that kind of give the final stamp approval for the National Register. But when it comes to the National Historic Landmark, it works through a committee that is appointed by the president, and then say goes through the Secretary of Interior, who then designates these places as, exceptional because of their abilities to illustrate U.S. heritage. So now coming to my introduction to preservation. So initially when I began my journey in 2015, I actually was interning in Washington, DC for the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights with absolutely no knowledge on what historic preservation was. I was just interested in Sikh American history. Being from Stockton, home of the first Sikh Gurdwara, it was just a side hobby, and I never really saw anything coming from it. But I was introduced through a mutual friend to the executive director of Asian Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation, Michelle Magalang. And she was telling me how API HIP, for short, hosts a conference every other year to kind of highlight Asian American sites of landmarks. So what I mentioned earlier for the register and the National Historic Landmark, although 90,000 plus properties seems like a lot, roughly only, well, the last time the study was done was in 2016 when I first met Michelle, and of those 90,000, less than 5% belong to minority communities. And within those 90,000, not a single one belongs to South Asian Americans. And those historic landmarks, there's even less than 5% that are that belong to minority communities. Again, also none being South Asian communities. So although it says, these sites are to highlight U.S. heritage and U.S. American history, we see a clear, we clearly see that, there's only a select handful that are of minority and minority sites that are considered to be significant to American history. So that was the problem that API HIP saw, and they started in 2008 to kind of combat that and bring to light the Asian American sites of importance. So in 2016, I became involved in API HIP, and starting off as an intern and then getting moved up to, I was asked to join the board of directors. Also in 2016, what we saw was the end of the Obama administration and the beginning of the Trump administration. So towards the end of the Obama administration, there was a huge push to get minority communities' sites onto the National Register by the Obama administration. So the National Park Service representatives from the National Park Services visited Stockton Gurdwara to have a conversation, and they wanted to discuss Stockton Gurdwara in particular. Stockton Gurdwara being founded in 1912, it has the richest history, something I'll touch upon more later. And these individuals kind of made it very clear that they had their eyes on Stockton Gurdwara for quite some time. However, there was never any action taken. So from there, a conversation began to get Stockton Gurdwara recognized as not just to get on the National Register, but to get it recognized as a National Historic Landmark, which would make it the first Sikh American site, first South Asian American site, and possibly, since the last time the study was done, possibly the first Asian American site as the National Historic Landmark as well. So when writing a National Historic Landmark nomination, I was given some advice. I was asked to write it out, but however, many individuals were telling me at that time that there's only a select elite group that writes a NHL, National Historic Landmark nomination. And I did not fit that group. I was a colored individual who had no background in historic preservation. These NHLs are typically written by upper middle class elderly individuals who have been involved in history for the past 30, 40 years. And that was sort of the gatekeeping within historic preservation. So the introduction to Sikh American preservation, so that challenge did not stop me. Instead, it motivated me to continue the work. Unfortunately, so I began doing research on Stockton Gurdwara, which you see black and white photo. I began doing research and writing the National Historic Landmark nomination. Unfortunately, due to the Trump administration, the committee that reviews these applications was disbanded, and then the gatekeeper of the National Register, and there was also problems with the Secretary of Interior, so that has come to a halt. However, there's been many complications where individuals are attempting to, the best word I can think of is steal the National Historic Landmark from me and kind of write it in their own way in an attempt, because it would have national significance, being the first South Asian American National Historic. So there's been a lot of complication with that. And however, the work has continued to that day, or to this day. And another process that I started was, although the national level came to a halt, began focusing on local and state level. So in 2017, I spoke to an individual who founded the King Gurdwara in Fresno County. He can be seen, I'm not sure if you guys can see my mouse, but he's the elderly individual in the white beard in the upper photo, Mr. Tejpaul. So he was one of the founding members of the King Gurdwara. He approached me, and from there we started the process of preserving King Gurdwara. And I was happy to announce that just earlier this year, after 3 years of research and back and forth with the committee, the site was designated as a county landmark. However, despite Sikhs being in America for over a century, possibly over 2 centuries, continuing research on that end, there's it clearly shows there is a need for more Sikh American historic preservation, because what we're seeing right now is, once I passed the King Gurdwara nomination earlier this year, it only became the 3rd recognized historic landmark for Sikhs, whether it be at the city, state, or national level. Well, there's none at the national level, so at the city and state level, it was only the third site of significance for Sikh Americans. The first, Stockton Gurdwara, being a city and state landmark. The second being Yuba City Gurdwara, close to Sacramento, California. That also being at the local level, and then King became the 3rd at the local level. So we see a lot of local, not even a lot, we only see 3 designations at the and 1 at the state level, despite the fact that Sikhs have been contributing members of the United States since they first arrived. There are many examples and a huge significance behind Stockton Gurdwara and other sites. We have, for example, the Gadar Leher is a revolutionary movement, anti-colonial movement, which seek to rid the British of India, and that began in Astoria, Oregon, but then moved its way down to California, and its headquarters was in San Francisco, but a main hub was Stockton Gurdwara, and that building is still in San Francisco, but there's absolutely no care of, there's to preserve the site, and it is in ruins. Another historical individual is Bhagat Singh Thind, who many individuals study his court case, his Supreme Court landmark case in 1920 for citizenship rights for Asian Americans. He was also associated with Stockton Gurdwara. We have Dalip Singh in the 60s, who became the very first Asian American member of Congress. Before he became a member of Congress and before his political career within American politics kicked off, he was funded by Stockton Gurdwara to attend UC Berkeley to pursue his PhD, and then he became the secretary of Stockton Gurdwara. And even in the 1910s and 1920s, and over the decades, Stockton Gurdwara sent delegates to Washington, D.C. to advocate for Asian Americans. So this entire history is kind of forgotten because the need for Asian American and Sikh American preservation is forgotten, and the gatekeepers kind of essentially keep and want to ensure that there's only a select few of individuals can enter this elite circle. For example, just last year, the National Register of Historic Multiple Property Documentation Form was passed, which looked at Asian Americans in California. They looked at 7 different Asian American communities, and one of those communities included South Asians and Sikh Americans. However, the individual who wrote that entire piece, although I was an advisor for that, the individual who wrote the piece was someone with absolutely zero background on South Asian American history. Their main focus was Japanese American history, which for some reason made them qualified to talk about South Asian history. And this is we have seen in the historic preservation field over and over again. Just to kind of end the presentation, this is a picture of Michelle, the executive director of APIA HIP, and myself. She posted this picture with the caption, "Tejpaul and I are on a advisory group on a pilot program on relevancy and history with California Citrus State Historic Park. After tonight's meeting, they asked us to be part of a portrait series for the project. We both couldn't help but laugh through it as it felt like a traditional Asian family portrait with the fancy chairs and settings. However, there was more behind the photo of everybody at the meeting talking about relevancy and history within the California Citrus State Historic Park, a park that talks about labor, talks about immigrants, talks about California history. Michelle and I were, and this photo was in 2017 when I did the PhD program at UC Riverside. Michelle and I were the only Asian Americans to be a part of that group, which just highlights the ongoing problem of gatekeeping within historic preservation. So this paper was just an attempt to kind of talk about this narrative, talk about the theory of historic preservation, but through the lens of preservation and through my own story to kind of highlight the problems that I have faced time and time again since 2016 and the problems I continue to face, and hopefully to shed light on the restrictive gatekeeping that is happening at the within the historic preservation field. Thank you. I think that was within my time, right?
It was almost perfectly timed. Thank you so much. Kim, would you like to share some thoughts and get us started on the conversation?
Well, I'm a San Joaquin local, so I learned I'm actually in San Joaquin County right now, so I'm in Tracy.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we're practically neighbors.
Yeah, I was like, I'm in Tracy. I was wondering the whole time. I was like, is he a Stockton native? And
yes.
I was like, okay. You said it, I was like, okay. But I was like, the fact that I don't even know much about the history of San Joaquin County has really pushed me more as an academic and personally to learn more. And I just wanted to learn your point of view on, because you mentioned how, I forgot what organization it was or who it was that was speaking about Asian American and Pacific Islander historical landmarks, but they were specifically focusing on Japanese, and how someone who's covering such a large region for historical preservation can truly encapsulate representation for everyone. How is that possible, or how do you think we could get started with that?
Well, I think so. The organization that I was mentioning a lot, APIA HIP, Asian Pacific Islander American Historic Preservation, and they started in 2008. So at the national level, there's the National Trust on Historic Preservation. However, and this is supposed to be the cream of the crop. Everyone who has anything to do with historic preservation attends this conference. However, 95% of those individuals are white. So that's where API HIP kind of came. So, a small group of Asian Americans who were attending the conference were like, okay, this is a problem. And they just kind of formed from there in 2008. They wanted to start talking about Asian American rights. So what API HIP does or attempts to do is kind of have a voice for every community on the board, which that diversity speaks, the diversity within Asian Americans in America, or Asian Americans. Have individuals representing South Asia, although that's still very broad. East Asia, Asia, even the Pacific Islands. So there's an attempt is being made to kind of have a voice for each and every community. But at the end of the day, it's also very difficult because of the gatekeeping within historic preservation and within academia in general. Asian Americans are, Asian Americans are kind of told not to pursue historic preservation, and that the field is not for them. That's why we see a lot of Asian Americans in other fields, and even within historic preservation, the gatekeeping is not allowing them to, you know, pursue their goals and pursue historic preservation. So that's why API formed, and it's an attempt to kind of challenge that system. And I mean, the work continues. It's an ongoing process, but we have won a few battles over the years. And now recently we're fighting to get more funding for Asian sites. And hopefully that will equate to more National Historic Landmarks or more Register of Historic Places for Asian Americans.
So I have a question, if you don't mind, Kim. Do you mind if we layer in our questions here? Okay. So you started us off with the context that this was a paper and a presentation that was facing a different audience than the religious studies audience. You know, we've named this panel religious studies. You want to say, here's a caveat. Maybe you won't be getting what you expected. Not to say this wasn't fascinating. It's absolutely a rich history that I was not aware of. And I also was not aware of the rich history of preservation. I mean, you hear about it as a thing, but I don't know anyone who is currently active as far as I know, so I don't intersect with this information. So it's elicited curiosity in me. So I'm very interested to read more and learn more. So thank you for this introduction. I'm curious, I'm thinking about the context that you gave for us. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about how this work, is this a completely separate project from the work that you're pursuing within and through religious studies methods, or do you, what is the overlap or the intersection? And not to diminish one or the other, but how does it intersect with the PhD process for you? Does it enrich it, or is it tangential?
So my introduction to historic preservation was my introduction to the PhD program. And so when I was interning with the Leadership Conference on Historic Preservation, or on, now I'm just saying historic preservation, but the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights in 2015, I was a pre-law student. I was studying for the LSAT, applying to law schools. And when it came to, when I met Michelle from API HIP, I also met Dawn Mabalo, who is an Asian American scholar originally from Stockton, born and raised, but she was a professor at San Francisco State University. And I met them at the first API HIP conference that I attended in 2016, and they kind of shed light on the problem of historic preservation and everything that I just told everybody here. They were telling me, and they essentially convinced, sometimes I say forced me to pursue a PhD, because they're saying that we need more Asian American scholars, and especially South Asian American scholars. So initially, when I applied to the PhD program, I had also applied to like 10, 15 law schools, and I only applied to this one PhD program at UC Riverside. And that one PhD program wasn't even the religious studies PhD program. I initially applied to the history department. And because I had met a professor there, Kathy Gudis, and I worked with her, and I met her through API HIP. And from there, we had a conversation. I had a conversation with Kathy. I also had a conversation with the chair of their department at that time, Dr. Pashar Singh, and kind of talked about my interest and what I wanted to research. And my main focus was Sikh American history. So that's where you get the history aspect of it. But the first word, Sikh, is where the religious studies aspect comes, right? And so my main focus, everything behind Sikh American history kind of revolves around the Gurdwara, revolves around this religious space. So that's where the introduction to religious studies kind of came, is this religious space was the central hub for all South Asian immigrants from the early 1900s till 1970s. I mean, up until 1970s, we had Muslim immigrants doing the namaz there every Friday. So it was more of a cultural, social, political, and religious hub for all South Asian immigrants. And that's where the cross from religion and kind of history comes. So after speaking with Kathy and Dr. Singh, we transferred my application over to the religious studies department.
Fascinating. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I have one more question. So like, I appreciated your presentation because you were using such like accessible vocabulary. Like I feel like anybody could really learn something from this, like even if you're not in higher education. And I just want to know, like when you do these kind of like research projects, like who's your intended audience? Like do you have a specific audience in mind when you write these kinds of research or take part in this?
Yeah, so I use accessible vocabulary on purpose because I've experienced it where the first time I sat in a PhD program, because again, like I was saying, I came in as a pre-law student, no background in religious studies. The first class I sat in, I had my laptop open and I was Googling a ton of words left and right because all these scholars, the material that I've read and that I continue to see being produced by scholars is by scholars for scholars. So the community, essentially, it's not accessible to the community. It's not accessible to minority groups. So by using accessible vocab, I hope to kind of bring voice to the community and allow the community to kind of have a say. And well, first they have to understand what is being said to have a say. Right. So if we're using such complex vocabulary, the community may not even understand what's being said. So the reason why I do it is, my intended audience is activists, community leaders, and just lay people in general, because at the end of the day, everybody could understand the vocabulary that I'm using. If I'm using, such accessible vocabulary, scholars can understand it as well. They might look at it and maybe be like, why is this individual using such, easy terms? But it's not for them. I mean, if they can understand it, that's the main goal. My main purpose is to make sure the community and community activists understand what is being said within the field and within academia. Thank you for that question as well, though, because that's always something like in the back of my mind. Every time I write a paper, every time I do a presentation, I try to rid myself of that or try to make it such a relaxed setting. Make sure that it's not like such a scholarly setting, such an academic.
Right. No, yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
I was like, listening to your presentation and like our conversations, I'm like, how do we not talk more? Because I have that same kind of goal in mind as well. And I'm actually from a pre-law background as well. So I went into religious studies not knowing that much either. So yeah.
Yeah, and that's just it, because at the end of the day, I mean, I've had several talks with Dr. Melissa Wilcox, and she's also saying that, these conversations that we have, and when we use such complex vocabulary, it's a gatekeeping within academia itself. And it's there to ensure that, first generation students have a tougher road to face. And it's kind of to weed out those individuals who may not understand these terms and may not know how to use them. So it's an attempt on my end to kind of, allow the community inroad to these conversations.
So I have I can bear witness because I'm not a religious studies student. I'm not a PhD candidate, and I don't know the subject matter, but I was immediately drawn in. And there are terms and things that I can understand, and I can relate to things that I do understand. So, I mean, this is beautiful, performative of how accessible the talk is. I have one other question, if you don't mind, if I'm not taxing your patience. So I'm thinking about the relationship between the registry and the preservation arm on the national level. And I'm wondering about the corollary for the state and county level, but I'm thinking about it in terms of the flow of money. So if there's a registry and then there's preservation, there's an amount of money, and then there's a certain amount of authority about, well, you're on our registry, so this is how things have to be treated and done. So there's an amount of bureaucracy that comes along with these things too. So I imagine there's a little bit of tension when we're talking in specific about sacred spaces. The urgency is there to make sure that they're preserved and recognized, because this is a marker for what our history is in this country, and to have these sites not be present is a way to obliterate history and to diminish people's contributions, right, in their lives. So I understand the drive on this side, but I'm thinking about the pushback on the regulation side. And I wonder about the conversations that you're having about the tension between those two, or am I just imagining a tension that doesn't exist?
No, I mean, it's definitely there, and the bureaucracy is definitely there, especially once you start talking about federal funding. So, and it's interesting that you mentioned like sacred spaces specifically, because there is a grant that comes from the National Trust. So first, the grant that comes from the funding that comes from at the federal level, majority of that funding goes to the National Trust on Historic Preservation. So, and then those are the individuals that kind of decide, okay, who gets what funding. And they have a specific grant for sacred spaces. And it's just such a complicated process, and because not many Asian Americans have even done such a grant, if I recall correctly, the Stockton Gurdwara would also become the first non-Christian sacred space on the National Historic Landmark. So there's a lot of firsts that are happening. So trying to weave through the entire process and figure out, you know, where the grants are, who to talk to. It's such a complicated process, and there is pushback because initially what they did was, as soon as it becomes a National Historic Landmark or becomes on the National Register, there are certain restrictions that the owners cannot do, and the government kind of gained control of the property. However, this was the community pushed back against that, and now the ownership stays within the community. However, if they do make changes that alters the significance, then they can they have a chance of being removed from the National Register. But so there's a huge process. However, because Asian American communities have never been introduced to historic preservation, because that's been primarily a white field, Asian Americans aren't really aware of what these guidelines and rules are. So they're learning as they go. And with only a select few individuals, and myself being, you know, in my mid-20s, trying to tell elderly individuals like, hey, we can't be doing this, we can't be doing this. I need permission, and I need access to X, Y, and Z, you know, whether it's within my own circles, whether it's, you know, within academic circles. Like I don't even have a PhD to my name. So academics wouldn't take me seriously yet. So that was the whole push to that's why I'm pursuing a PhD. So I will be taken seriously at that level, but even within the community. So there's politics at every stage, and I don't have a very straightforward answer because I'm still trying to kind of figure it out. I'm figuring it out as I go.
All right.
That
Thank
sounds
you.
like well.
Yeah, that's so I learned so much in 35 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
The whole world has opened up.
Yeah. Do you have any more questions, Catherine?
I don't. Tejpaul, is there anything else that you think you would want to add to this to bring us around to a conclusion?
I mean, just the fact that this gatekeeping that we see within historic preservation is, you know, a long-standing tradition within many different fields, and you know, we just have to make everything more accessible for people of color and for minority groups in order to ensure that this gatekeeping doesn't stand anymore. So that's what my attempt is with, you know, the PhD in the religious studies department and even my work in the historic preservation field. And I hope it pays off in the long run through these small victories, you know, getting San King Gurdwara recognized as a county landmark, and hopefully somewhere down the road, getting Stockton Gurdwara recognized as a national historic landmark.
Well, I echo that hope, and it seems as though I have little doubt. I mean, I don't have much faith in bureaucracy per se, but if passion is enough of an ingredient, I think that you are going to be successful. That's my hope anyway.
Thank you.
Well, thank you both. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Tejpaul. This has been really enlightening, and I hope it's been useful and fruitful for you and for your work as well. So good luck to you both, and thank you. Take care.
Thank you for hosting, and thank you, Kim,
Of course.
for responding.
Thank you for presenting.
All right. Thank you both.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.